Welcome to Mindcrime Liberty Show with me, Swithin Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we discuss, should we trust the experts? Now, if you haven't been living in a cave in Afghanistan for the last 18 months or so, you will have realized that the media are always telling us that we should trust the experts because the experts know everything there is to know about coronavirus, COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2, whatever you want to call it, and we should just trust what they say. Now, the question is, well, should we? It is interesting when you get the people in the media saying trust the experts. It happens to be the experts that they think are saying the right things. So, for example, people such as Jay Bhattacharya, if I get his name right, is a professor of medicine at Stanford, who is very much against lockdowns and says they're the worst public health decision effectively of all time. But he's not the right expert to listen to. Effectively because they disagree with what they think is true, which then, of course, brings into question to begin with, do they really actually have any independent criteria as to what constitutes an expert? And secondly, whether or not they really ought to listen to them at all, or for what reason you should listen to them. So I thought it would be interesting if we discuss, what actually is an expert? Why should we trust them, and when should we trust them? It just seems to be obvious that we do take account of expertise to some extent in the general world, but can we distinguish certain situations and in which it's more worthwhile taking into account an expert opinion and other ones where it's not? So, Tim, first question then is, and I think possibly one of the most important one here is, what actually is an expert? How would you go about conceptualizing the idea of expertise?
Interesting question here. I guess I'd have to ask an expert to understand what experts to ask here, which is sort of like the enigma in itself here. I think Sean Connery in The Untouchables, I forget the character name, says, who do you trust when there's no one to trust? You go outside of the sphere. He's speaking of like the Chicago Police Department. Again, I'm not a fan of Prohibition, but I do think The Untouchables is a good movie, and I do think Sean Connery is a good actor. But you go outside of the corrupt Chicago Police Department to find a young recruit who becomes his sort of sidekick. So it goes back to the question of like, who do you trust here? I mean, you can't just say, well, we need an expert in experts. Nassim Taleb, the old Nassim Taleb of a few years ago, not the sort of Edward Snowden hating lockdown supporting version, big pharma supporting version that's current there, wrote an article entitled "Intellectuals Yet Idiots." And that was an interesting piece. And someone, a very astute commenter, said that what Nassim Taleb is doing is being I think Russ Roberts said the same thing. He's being sort of an anti-expert expert. So maybe that's what we need. We need anti-expert experts to decide who is and isn't an expert here. I guess those could be epistemology philosophies of epistemology. Maybe that's what we could ask. This debate over who exactly is and isn't an expert, I mean, is not a new debate in any way. I mean, in a certain sense, it's related to the Reformation historically. Whose interpretation of various texts and what doctrines you can sort of delineate from those texts is sort of the Lutheran question in itself. Is radical feminism, could that be adopted from certain things in Corinthians or Romans out of it? And of some questions, who knows? Maybe the Quakers at the time couldn't, but you could extract that way of interpretation, textual interpretation, go either way. So the question of what doctrines can you adopt out of any given things, because the science, so to speak, which is a modern expert, doesn't read itself. What we're really doing is we're just talking about authoritative sources of the experts, various state universities and state credentialed by the state. So oftentimes what expert means is what the state or the official position is. The sort of party line. It's very much true in the United States. I would say, sorry, conservatives, I'd say there's sort of always been a kind of position like that. What exactly, no golden age, so what exactly is the position? I'm not sure. But clearly in the coronavirus, we had, whatever you want to call it, we had anyone who isn't buying the certain line, it can change monthly. As we saw with the policy of mask, it changed monthly. Because the things change. So as to who isn't and isn't an expert, it's a very much of an enigma question. Is Alex Jones an expert, for example, on the U.S. government? I'd say in a lot of ways, Alex Jones is an expert on various subplots of the U.S. government. And put them together. Is Graham Hancock an expert on ancient history? Who knows? I mean, one of the problems here is related to epistemology, what we can know. A few weeks ago, we just did an episode with terminal philosophy and the errors of historians, and so to speak. That's a very interesting topic there, errors and blind spots of historians. I got that from Taleb also. You started making anti-history, to say, we don't know anything that happened between these years. Like say 1300 and 1400 in a certain place. We just don't know what happened. We don't have any records. That'd be sort of an anti-history, but there wouldn't be much of a market for it. So I do think there are experts. This was an old left-wing anarchist was asked this question. You see the experts in bootmaking, for example. I do think in things which have physical objects as a product, there is expertise in, like aircraft engines or car engines or things like that. You can have experts in that. I do think there are experts in practical language arts, so to speak. Like if you want to make a text if you want to write directions to assemble a piece of furniture, I do think you want to make your English sort of not overly verbose, but not too verbose. I do think there is a language. It's not art. It's more of a practical art, so to speak. It's off in la la land of subjectivity. Maybe I like complicated prose, some people could say. So now there might be experts in like the history of Shakespeare to what we know, or the history of whatever given figure. But I do think, as always, there's a huge amount of states and the megacorps, which is the classic Chomskyite and Jones position too, Alex Jones, where experts just mean whatever the state and the sort of backers of the state say it is or isn't, and that sort of sucks. But I if I break my leg, I'll go to a doctor. But if I want to learn more about say a given time period of history, I'll go look at historians in certain things. But you have to be aware that these might be epistemology questions. Right? What can we actually know? And those are, to me, very interesting through the limits here. So I think, what do you make of my rantings over who isn't an expert? I didn't really answer the question, probably. I guess it's the sign of a good expert is never to answer the question. But I don't really have a given advice here on that. Swithin?
I think you gestured towards expertise and seemingly defining it in a somewhat pragmatic sense. For example, my shoe is broken, I go to the cobbler. My leg is broken, I go to the doctor. That seems a relatively pragmatic approach, which actually is something I'll get to later. I think this is another question is, well, what is the purpose of the expert? Why do we ask the expert, what is the goal? That, I think, is a very relevant question, which we'll come to later. I was thinking about, how you could define an expert. And I think, in general, I think what we mean by someone having expertise is somebody who has a large proportion of knowledge relative to the total possible knowledge in a particular area. So if there is a situation where we know basically what we can at least delineate boundaries about what there is to know and what there isn't to know, then if someone has above average knowledge of that, then we could consider them an expert in certain respects. So here, I mean, it'd be obvious. So you can have like comic book store guy from The Simpsons. Well, he is clearly an expert in particular comics. Well, why? Because all the comics of a certain writer, I don't know, let's say Grant Morrison, he has read all of them, and he has studied them multiple times. It's like, well, okay, he's probably an expert. Well, why? Because we've got an idea of what there is to actually know. So in a sense, in the arts or human artifacts, in a way, it's kind of easier to be an expert because you can delineate, the total sum of possible knowledge in a way that you can't in other areas, at least not to the same extent. The problem, though, it comes back to Donald Rumsfeld, though, is, well, there are unknown unknowns and there are known unknowns. There's things you know that you don't know. Now, I suppose that's relatively less of a problem if you know that you don't know it and you can sort of delineate it. But it's the unknown unknown which is a problem. And the question is, well, if you use my definition of extensive knowledge of a particular area, if there's great uncertainty, as in unknown unknowns, let's define it in that sense, about how much knowledge there possibly is within that particular area, then the importance of the experts, at least everything else being equal, would seem to diminish, because they kind of really aren't an expert. They just so happen to know more than other people, but nobody really knows very much anyway. So, does it really matter to the same extent? So that would be sort of like my general sort of definition. But then when it comes to, which ones do I listen to? As I say, this depends on your goal. So, for example, when you have you're feeling ill, will you go to the doctor? Why? Well, because you feel ill. Your car is not doing what you wanted to do, so you go and see the mechanic, and he can tell you how to fix it, hopefully. Why? Or how does he know? Well, he's done them before. Or at least he claims he's done them before. Other people you may know have been to him for a similar procedure on the car before, and it has been fixed, and it works. And you've got review sites and various things. So this kind of makes sense. You get back the TripAdvisor type. So for a restaurant, how would you know a restaurant is good? Well, other people say it's good who have been. And so you can look at those, and obviously you can use other factors as well to determine whether you think they are going to produce good food or not in there. But then again, it depends on your goal. If you don't like Chinese food, don't go to a highly rated Chinese restaurant. Well, why? Well, because you don't like Chinese food. Because that wouldn't make much sense. So there's a question of goal, and there's a question of are the experts actually genuinely expert in a sense? And so I think in the cases where they're sort of, as you mentioned, physical, sort of empirically verifiable data points, that you can go, okay, this guy has made clothes before that people said were good, and the clothing is quite standard product. You can reproduce it. It's like, oh yeah, this clothes is good. Oh, cars. Oh, Mercedes have a good reputation. Oh, okay. Well, we're going to make the car, and some other guys have the same car, so I'll buy the car. It's the same thing. It's replicable. And so I think the extent to which experts produce things which are replicable and sort of relevantly similar, although that's a very large qualifier as to what constitutes relevantly similar, is that you can have good confidence that they're going to be able to do what they claim they're going to do. So you've seen that British Airways has pilots that go into the air and they fly and they take you to where you want to go. Okay, well, you can probably trust that they're going to do that. And I think that is perfectly reasonable to trust. So situation on a practical basis, I think the expert is, you have a problem, you go to them, and they have some empirically verifiable record. That said, of course, you don't need to always listen to the expert, because, I mean, you could go to an expert just for information. So you could say, oh, how much will it cost to fix the car? Okay. Well, knowing that and having an expert response, and let's suppose it is in fact that cost, doesn't necessarily tell you either way what you should do. And even the mechanic could say, well, it's not really worth doing. But then he might not know that this car was maybe your granddad's car and you want to keep it going, and therefore it's worth it for you to have it fixed. So even in those cases, they can't necessarily guide your action in as clear a way as you might originally think. So those would be sorts of the types of experts I would listen to. And I remember that people are expert, art history historians. They know things that you don't. Worth knowing. That doesn't mean they're right, but it's worth finding information out about them, of what they say and things, and look at competing sort of narratives as such. That's kind of worth knowing. So it's not to say that experts are useless. Rather, it's to say, well, useful for what purpose? And the ones who have an empirically testable record, I think, are ones who are you're more likely to trust. What we've got really today, though, is a situation where, with lockdown policy and epidemiology, what you've basically got is not empirical verifiability and a track record of doing things well. What you've effectively got is just computer modeling. They are in the game of being expert predictors. And that is effectively what their claimed expertise is. And this is the same with the quote unquote climate scientists, is that, well, they're just predictors. They don't actually do anything to provide a service that people can go, oh yeah, it's good. They're just engaged in predictions. And when you say that their predictions are wrong, well, they're the best we could have known at the time. And or will claim that, well, actually, even though it looks like they were wrong, they weren't actually wrong. And that's kind of where they go. So do you think that's a fair characterization of the lockdown epidemiologists and climate scientists, etc.? And do you think I've contrasted them fairly with people like the engineer and the car mechanic and the chef?
I would totally agree with your comparison here. That there's a huge difference between a carpenter and a computer modeler. A carpenter has a piece of furniture you can look at, whether it's a good piece or a bad piece. There's certain limits, and there's certain unlimited things. Same way with certain much science that is not explicitly with a capital E practical. Or impractical in some sense. Like a lot of physics is practical if you want to build nuclear weapons. A lot of sort of advanced physics or other areas like that. You do sort of need that kind of knowledge. But the more way you get from use, the less it can be judged, and it just sort of becomes a sort of internal discourse of like a sort of nerdy internal discourse, for better or for worse. So I would agree. I would agree with that statement there. Do you have any other questions, or do you want me to switch them?
No. All I was going to say was I think when it comes to what's particularly interesting about medical health, moving away from the global warming thing, is there's no obvious standard for human health in the way that there's a standard for a car. There is a standard version of the Mercedes E-Class, and we know what it is. We know what the blueprints are, and we can test whether or not the version of the car matches up with the blueprints, and that's how it's supposed to be. Thing is, though, you don't really have such a thing with humans. And an obvious thing here is you might come across the BMI measure for how fat you are. Did you come across that?
Yeah. Yes, I did. And when I was in middle school, I was considered to be underweight.
It's notorious for being inaccurate in the extreme. I mean, I'm clearly not as light as I should probably be. Nevertheless, for me to get in ideal is very difficult. I think possibly when I was married, I probably was, but I was at the upper edge of the ideal limit in BMI measure. Because it doesn't take into account body shape and all these whole other things. And what you're doing is it's being based on a sort of standardized idea of like who's healthy and who's not. And this is how a lot of sort of medicine seems to go. It means you're looking to see whether you are out. So, for example, my mother went for a blood test and her white blood cell count was relatively down, and they were concerned about this. But it's like, she's never ill. She's not like more ill. She's not like she has AIDS. It's not like she's ill all the time. Oh, your white blood cell count is low. It's that's probably the problem. It's just a case they're just doing it for another purpose. And it's like, oh, white blood cell count is low. It's like, but low relative to what? And this is, I think, this sort of approach to sort of medicine and medical health is accentuated by the concepts of public health, because in a way, a lot of quote unquote public health is all about the average. Oh, we need to get people to eat different things and be different weights. Why? Well, because we're measuring against this sort of the standard that we've created, which doesn't actually exist. Now, I'm not saying that there's not fat people who should be less fat than they are. That's obviously true. But to create this just metric that you can just read off a sheet, I think is very anti-health, and really is a result of a centralized medical system, which is primarily state controlled, especially in England. And it isn't something that's just responding to people going, I'm ill, treat me. Because if that was really the case, and that's how it was built, it would be based much more around sort of individual needs and sort of circumstance. And the experts, as it were, would be more attuned to the fact that all the patients aren't necessarily the same. Now, that's not to say that they aren't, but rather this sort of like general sort of standardization of the approach when it comes to medical health, I think really does feed into this sort of top-down expertise puppet show, effectively, that we have in current public health policy. Tim, do you think that's a fair characterization of the effect of this sort of standardized view of health on policies of lockdowns, epidemiology? Well, not sure epidemiology. Well, I suppose to some extent epidemiology, lockdown policy, and how this sort of contrasts with sort of cars or anything else you want to comment on.
I've always been I've been suspicious of doctors for a while now. I've been suspicious of doctors, for example. I've been suspicious of doctors since I was in high school. I've been suspicious of doctors. I won't get into the exact reason why I'm suspicious of doctors, but I'll just state something. I was just slightly misdiagnosed for something, which is a common problem, and then which might have led to other problems. So I've been suspicious of doctors. I became more suspicious of doctors when I became something of a libertarian, somewhat of a right-wing libertarian. I became more suspicious of doctors. I think because I think to a large extent the medical apparatus is a sort of modern creation in a lot of ways. The doctor thing. I guess Michel Foucault, of all people, who again a postmodern conservative here, friend not enemy, talked about the medical gaze. And that's one of the sort of medical gaze. It's a very interesting thing. How the two under criticized groups of people in society to have authority over people are doctors and teachers, whether university professors who are, or public school teachers. There are people that generally get empathy, and they don't get, and they have considered to be expertise. And this is where I think it's disputed here. So I don't really, I have about as much. I have about the same opinion of doctors that the Black Lives Matter people have of American cops. Although, except the Capitol riot police, they have the great view of them because they're defending democracy. So yeah, I have a sort of low view of doctors at all. Again, if I do break my leg, I will go to a doctor. But in there, you get back to health. And interestingly enough, people do break their legs. They do have long term. You can get if you have screws put in your leg or something like that. In 30 to 50 years, those screws might start coming out. Now, again, should you have gotten them in at the time? Yeah, of course. But even when people have you break their back and get something in, they do suffer long-term problems. So if it's bringing people back to normal, in some ways, the broken car that has the new transmission is never as same or as good as the car with its original transmission, to use a sort of physical analogy here. So the person who had Lyme disease even if they got cured of it, they're probably never the same as they were before they had Lyme disease. But that's a counterfactual there. I mean, again, you can try to avoid all woods, but that's a sort of draconian thing. Although people like doing draconian things, so maybe that's the solution to fix Lyme disease. So yeah, the doctors aren't miracle workers in any sense, and there's certainly a sense that they are viewed as such. Many cancer treatments don't work, for example, and they just people don't die. And there's many drugs that people are given by doctors that don't cure people. And this sort of showed up in the FDA debate on. Now, David Friedman instantly argued that David Friedman holds you that all drugs should be legalized. But interestingly, you get like the left regulatory state defenders like Sam Cedar, who say, well, if we didn't have the FDA, snake oils would be sold. I don't know. I mean, there's sort of big snake oil rackets and there's small snake oil rackets. I think like Ritalin pills are big snake oil rackets. A lot of these sort of, and people like Nassim Taleb are correct that a lot of diabetes is manageable, and it's much better to be manageable by not taking insulin. So yeah, the medical profession is totally corrupted. I have a very low view of the medical professionals. I do have a high view of the nurses who are currently being laid off because they don't want to take another vaccine. But in general, I don't view them as heroes. I mean, they're useful. They are useful in lots of situations. But things like plumbing, I mean, that's extremely useful insofar as, not having waste in the street. Those people are extremely useful. Garbage men. Those are the people that are useful and account for a large portion of health. But those are my overall thoughts on medical expertise. I have a very low view of medical expertise, and I'd say they should be attacked as such. And they don't have much use for me because, if you're healthy, you have the least likely to go to the doctor. And doctors should be avoided here. In olden times, they used to view hospitals as like death houses. People would go to die, and that's sort of true. It's sort of correct anthropological insight that hospitals are, they're not the nicest place to die. Many people, when they're younger, say they prefer to die at home, for example, rather than die, attached to a tube in some air-conditioned, Czech police headquarters. Hospitals in the United States have terrible architecture. That's one thing I interestingly noticed. Those are my overall comments. Very low. So, what then? Want to continue?
Oh yeah. Hospitals are horrible places. I mean, they are useful to an extent. Although I do think one of the reasons why people try and take drugs that they don't need to, and the experts can sell them to them, or well, maybe they say they don't, but they tend to take them, is basically because they try to sort of they think that doctors can kind of get rid of death and pain, and they can sort of extend life indefinitely because they have no sort of conception. Well, I mean, you could claim of the afterlife of a certain description. The material life here is the only thing worth living, so we just need to extend it as sort of far as possible, even if the quality is terrible. Whilst at the same time, oddly, in society, then we're kind of promoting euthanasia, which is kind of a really sort of odd contradiction, but nevertheless seems to be the case. I mean, with doctors, though, in general, I don't know. I seem to have I have a higher view of surgeons than I have of physicians, because surgeons can at least point to something that's wrong and go, "Oh, that's wrong. This is we need to fix it. It's fine." I had a problem with my thumb once. This is a fun story. I had a problem with my thumb because I was playing computer games too much, and I changed the configuration on the keyboard, which caused me great pain eventually, and wasted away my muscle because of the way I had it. And the doctor goes and said, I got de Quervain's tenosynovitis. Just do this. Hold this splint in. We just need to build the muscle back up. Right, fine. That makes sense. And that was one of the few times I've been to a medical expert and go, oh, right, I understand. This kind of makes sense. When you get to physicians, I think it becomes even more sketchy. Not that they're not useful and they don't know anything, but how do you know what level this thing is, this sort of chemical of something should be in my blood at this level, what's high, what's low. That isn't obvious. And so medical health there is not obvious in a way that I think surgeons to a large extent do. I suppose this is another reason why I would approach medicine in such a way as I would tend to always opt for the least invasive option, depending on the context, obviously. But my default position would be going, do as little as possible, because basically your body knows what it's doing, is in a sort of metaphorical sense. Do as little intervention as necessary, because there's kind of things you don't know, and you could cause some greater problems. I mean, so for example, with that, an obvious one is when they used to get rid of appendixes all the time. Oh, the appendix is a vestigial organ. Evolution was useless. Don't know what that is. Get rid of it. But now they know it regulates bacteria in the gut. Now, still doesn't mean you shouldn't get rid of an appendix at a certain point. But the problem thing is, when they started just ripping them out for no apparent reason, well, for very sort of relatively minor reasons, it's like, probably wasn't the best idea. And so I think you're going to get this with human body medicine. But when it comes to experts, though, as a more specific point in respect to vaccines, which I think is interesting, I really have very little faith at all in the quote-unquote public health experts. Why? Because nobody will tell me, no one will give me a self-report system on the internet that I can put all my risk factors in and go, what is my probability of being hospitalized? What is my probability of dying if I catch coronavirus? Nobody will tell me. And nobody will tell me what the potential problems of a vaccine may be. Now, it might not have any, but anecdotally, there are lots of problems thereafter. Now, whether it's caused by the vaccines is the question. We don't know. But the thing is, they won't even tell me. And so this is another thing when it comes to experts. If an expert won't tell me why they are advocating something, I think that's a perfectly reasonable position to take is, I don't believe you. If nobody can actually tell me why you think I should do something, and it not in its and why it's in my interest. If you can't do that, I'm like, no, I'm not going to believe you. And this just seems to be the way it's taken in medical things for a while. You just trust the experts that just do what they tell you. It's like, well, why? Well, because I kind of don't necessarily trust everybody. So I think that's a big red flag when it comes to trusting the experts. Oh, and especially when vaccines are said, oh, you should take this vaccine because you can go to the cinema and you can do fun things. It's like, I thought the vaccine was about health. Oh, apparently isn't. And so even if I were minded to take one, I'm like, well, you're pretty much propagandizing me to do it for reasons other than health. That probably means it's not really about health, is it? So I won't take one. I mean, maybe I'm just too contrarian for my own good, but like, Tim, what's your response when they say, oh, you should take something, but we won't tell you why it's good for you? What's your reaction to that kind of stuff?
I also might be too contrarian for my own good, but I would say that this is where skin in the game matters, which is another Talebian contest. If they do the actual procedure, then you have more confidence in there. And to the credit, most of the people who took this thing have posted on Facebook them taking it. Now, we can presume they got the real thing and get saline solution, which is some people. But so if skin in the game might be a qualification for that. One of the things Taleb said is that, like, when they force helicopter mechanics to take they did this is an empirical study to determine this insight, so there is a certain that problem. But helicopter mechanics service helicopters better if they're required to take test rides in it. That's an interesting pickup I got from Taleb. So now on the bigger things, we're all sort of for better or for worse included in the process. Then it becomes much more difficult to determine because you don't have skin in the game there. If the people, this also comes up in the smoking debate. If people, many of the executives and scientists who did the smoking did actually smoke. Now, I have a very neutral view on smoking. Do I think pregnant women should smoke? But that's probably no. Do I think smoking is egregious? I think it's vastly overrated. And actually, coffee drinking has probably replaced that, which may actually be worse. But then again, vaping has replaced, is coming back too. So it's an interesting comeback. It has a sort of relaxing thing. So this comes back to the no trade-offs, no solutions, just trade-offs. Medical professionals are terrible. I have a very low view of them. I don't. Let me think. And the recent events have just sort of dropped them to me in the toilet, into the toilet, so to speak. Those are my thoughts on that. I don't trust them, but for anyone who's debating it, at some point, it's probably not the hill to die. It's probably the hill to die on. It's probably not a hill worth dying on it, considering the number of people have taken it. But who knows what's going to happen with that? I mean, that's a very vague, very vague thing. But I think a further unmasking of the state, and the various apparatuses of it, needs to continue. And then for that reason, the past 18 months have been great at it. For the most part, you could argue that informal state power has grown significantly, but also, and I view state medical authorities as a version of that. I know some normie conservatives will say I'm a postmodernist for saying that, but I think it's entirely the case. When public health becomes a political issue, then it is a political issue. Then health is political in some way. There's not some sort of venue where it's just we have these sort of platonic lectures here. Those are my views on that. Moving on to it, I'd like to ask you a question. What do you make of the skin in the game test for experts? Again, you can't have this in lots of realms. You can't have this in lots of realms. Ron Paul, would say that if you want to advocate war, you sort of have to be involved in the war in some way. You have to have your son. I think that was I think the Romans or the Greeks used to have this view that, if you're going to advocate for war against the Persians or whoever, you yourself need to go lead the army there to do it. Now that's actually sort of honorable in a certain neat way. But there's many areas where that's not, if you're sick, there's no way the doctor can make him sick with your exact problem and do the treatment. So there is certain ways that might be, I'm just giving an impossible standard. But what do you make of skin in the game? That's an interesting solution to this problem, but it also in many areas doesn't.
Well, skin in the game is essential. This is the problem primarily of public health as such. Is the public health officials, they have no skin in the game at all. None whatsoever. If things go wrong, they go, well, it's best we could have known at the time. Because it's all based on statistical modeling and it's just prediction. It's not actually solving a problem that you can see. Someone's got a problem. This is a solution. And it's definitely, if you're a doctor and everyone goes to you with a broken toe ends up dead, you kind of go, well, probably don't go to the doctor. And he'll lose business and he'll be out of the game. So skin in the game is essential. And it's just the obvious fact that anybody tied in with the state has very little skin in the game, the extent to how high they are. The worst thing they could in principle lose their jobs, but when they're making these decisions, they won't typically. And if they do, they'll just be moved elsewhere. On the politicization point, Matt Ridley commented recently. He spoke to a scientist that he knew, and he said, "Oh, do you think it's likely that the coronavirus came out of a lab in Wuhan?" And he was like, "Yeah." Matt Ridley said, "Well, are you going to tell anybody about this?" He's like, "No, I'm not." Because everybody knows that going off script basically means, well, maybe not exactly career-ending activity, but is not going to help your chances of ascending a bureaucracy or staying there for a particularly long time period. So that sort of anecdote, which may be untrue, but I have I haven't known Matt really to be untruthful in the past, so I might trust him on this. And so, yeah, your comment before, yeah, it's entirely politicized when you get to a government position. So people I knew before, like in February, say, oh no, coronavirus, nothing to worry about, just a flu, it's nothing, calm down. And then when the people above them said it's the new Black Death, they then started ringing the church bells. Oh no, this is another thing which I object to, sort of like the experts in the medical establishment, is most of them just do what they're told, because that's how they've learned it up in the medical establishment, just being told, doing what they're being told by other people. And another thing as well, when I was at university, most of the medical students I knew weren't very clever. I mean, they could remember things, and they probably do a decent job. That's fine, but that's no real difference being a car mechanic, in a certain sense. But when you're getting, some more difficult questions about, counterfactuals and stuff like that, that's not really their thing. So whether they are actually sort of relevantly experts to comment in these areas is not obvious. So yeah, skin in the game is vital, and things based on computer models and stuff, those people just don't have skin in the game. Since when have you had someone from the intergovernmental panel on climate change get publicly humiliated because his estimation of the increase in average world temperature was like massively higher than it actually was? Never happens. And so I think what you've got here, especially with lockdown-y stuff, epidemiology and things, is said before, it's just computer modeling, it's counterfactual claims, which can always say that it wasn't their fault, did it the best they could, and they never feel any real consequences for it. And so I have very little reason to believe them.
Speaking of counterfactuals, I want to extend this claim. This is also true of political scientists and, international relations and State Department type people. You mentioned Donald Rumsfeld, and Donald Rumsfeld's the sort of genius of that speech is, it's in some ways it's the perfect speech. It's in some ways there's no scenario in which his advice on invading there's no evidence of weapons of mass death. There's no link between in the two various countries. There was the sort of precise text of the speeches roughly is there's almost no scenario in which war in his viewpoint wouldn't be the correct approach. Even if there wasn't weapons of mass destruction there, okay, then you should still invade, because there might be. We have to invade to make sure we know that there isn't there. So even if the intelligence was entirely faulty or it was entirely correct, you still have to invade, because there's the threat that it could be weapons of mass, or there could be the elements of there. So that those type of counterfactual claims for intervention, again, this borders on a philosophy problem that gets manifested in the real world. So I mean, to be fair, in a way, even though they're very rarely fair to us, to the interventionistas like Rumsfeld, like the Faucis and the Fergusons, when they want to intervene in things, I mean, maybe it would be the case that every city in Europe and the United States would have 10 buildings knocked down by terrorists from Baghdad and Kabul. Okay, maybe that'd be the case if Donald Rumsfeld's invasion didn't happen. All the tall buildings in every major city would have been knocked down. But I don't know. I don't know if that's a likely scenario. Maybe it was a one-off thing. Maybe Alex Jones is right, and it was the CIA did it. Maybe the far right is right, and even more unsavory allegations are correct, which interestingly align with other far left viewpoints. But nonetheless, maybe that would have been the case. Maybe all the buildings. Okay. Then thanks Donald Rumsfeld for saving all the tall buildings in the world, or thanks what's his face, Fauci, for saving us from ourselves. But is that a likely outcome of this? Well, let's just look at various states in the United States or various countries in Europe, like Belarus or Nicaragua. Did death and destruction come? No. So in this regard, the counterfactuals, you may want to grant the sort of peskiness of the philosophy of science, or the philosophy in general, the philosophy of analysis in general. Even want to grant them as the fairest, most charitable version. They don't even seem to answer those. And in some ways, it might be answering the counter thing. So international relations, there is a possibility that terrorism might have increased, and actually, the United States and Britain and France are actually worse off because of various migrations and various other things that were all effects of that. So this is an instance where the doctors and the experts made things worse. And not only worse, they made it worse, and it was expensive worse. So there's huge, in the Bastiat terms, the seen and unseen. Think of all the people that, died, the million people that died in various wars over there. If they were still alive, or the various people in the United States and Britain that were still alive, or those $6 trillion went to, I don't know, fund something else, or just people didn't have to work as much and could just sit at home, that would be great. So that also applies to doctors. Thad Russell was on, I'm not sure if it's Thomas Szasz, but Thomas Szasz influenced person. He was interviewed with the errors of psychologists and those type people. And he said, Thad Russell was saying that he spent thousands of dollars on, this sort of psychology, and he just used it therapy. I forget what the precise term is. He just used them as charlatans. So I mean, in some ways, for the Sam Cedar types, the state, uses its influence for whatever it's worth to sanction snake oil salesmen in a way. So you have the FDA sanctions snake oil salesman. I'll take the private snake oil salesman over the public snake oil salesman. They at least can be held accountable. So those are my comments overall, with respect to philosophy and Donald Trump's bill.
That sounds very similar to Hopper's private slaveholder being better than the public slaveholder. He has much more to lose.
I was thinking of the same thing. I was hoping you'd.
Yeah. The private guy can't brutalize his slave too much because he could sell him. Whereas the public guy who doesn't really own him is just renting him, so he does what he wants, can't sell him. There's no real reason to keep him in decent nick over a long time period because just rent it. I think that experts, as just a closing statement, I do think experts are useful, but the question is, what are they useful for? And even when you have expert opinion that doesn't tell you what you should do, there's certain factors you need to know that are only known to you to determine what you ought to do. And so we need to be quite judicious in which information taken and which is relevant. I'd also point out here that being an expert does not mean that you have lots of letters after your name or you're in a university department. I mean, you read it and you go, does this guy make sense? Does this argument ring true? Obviously, you may not have identified a fallacy, but this is where you look at other people and go, okay, they've responded to him. And this is what annoys me about the whole coronavirus stuff, is why don't you have a public debate between Jay Bhattacharya and a lockdown supporter? Now, this may have happened, but I'm not aware of it. To see, the strongest case against what they're doing and have this in public so people can be reasonably assured, oh, actually, no, this is the right one. This Jay guy is crazy.
The reason is because they would lose.
Well, obviously they would lose. But the fact that people don't do this is, I think, a big black mark against him. Same thing like, oh, no, we can't have them. We can't have him in debate because he's racist. It's like, well, if he's obviously racist, you could have him up there and you could realize that he's really bad and so no one will listen to him. But then the people say, oh, no, but if you give him a platform, then people believe him and they'll get more support. And To which I respond, well, if that's true, hang on,
I just cut in 1 second. I also want to add that I think they'd also lose on the climate change thing, because even if they could win the empirical thing, then what do we do about it? Do we close down all oil production? I mean, what exactly can be done? And you have to bring up, like, are these people actually just primitivists at heart? And sort of, should we have nuclear power? So even if they can win the certain debates, and many of these people get annoyed when you point out the fact that they drive an SUV, or Al Gore flies in airplanes, and just view it as a hominid, or they'll point out, like, oh, well, I'm Neil Ferguson. I could go have sex with other people outside of my bubble, but no one else can. So they'll just interpret that as ad hominem, and they'll say, well, this position still is true, that we should do it. Well, then you're sort of admitting that there are trade-offs. So that's another annoying thing. They'd lose the debate if it was held in turn, and they do lose in a way. People vote with their feet, so to speak. So yeah, continue on, Swithin. Sorry for interrupting.
Oh yeah, no. Yes, the site as a whole was not directed towards public acknowledgement of truth. It's just sort of hived off into certain departments, and certain things are verboten. And you're not allowed to say them. It's basically heresy. And again, that's another thing. When an expert is completely dismissive of another school, or doesn't even acknowledge its existence or whatever, I'm like, well, okay, do you really know what you're talking about here? And then just flat out dismiss it. It's not something that I'm going to go, oh yeah, they're kind of reasonable, and they have evidence and argument and reason on their side, not to sort of sound like Stefan Molyneux. So I would say, an expert. I mean, one of our trusted track record as well. But if it's advice for the future, somebody who recognizes alternative views, someone who can say, well, that makes sense, but it's wrong for this reason, and you can go, yeah, okay, he considered that. Yeah, it kind of makes sense. And the people against him, yeah, they're not as good. Okay, believe him and put your money there. And again, that guy needs to have skin in the game. And if you do that, the expert is probably going to be relatively less bad. But the extent to which you can't do that is the extent to which the relative useless. I mean, again, it's a medical one here. Is basically no one in medicine has any real idea of nutrition. At least that's my understanding from nutritionists. They just don't know anything about it. And so lots of things that could be sort of solved by nutrition, eating better, etc., or vitamin supplements stuff. No idea. They just believe what they're told, and like a little small section of medical school, and they go that way. And so that's a problem. Oh, just on the climate change, reminded me. Climate change is interesting. It's actually similar to human health. There's an implicit assumption that there's an optimum average world temperature, in the way that there's sort of like an optimum sort of average human physiology. But the thing is, no one will tell me what the optimum world temperature is and why.
The funny thing is, Swithin, a lot of these types will shout naturalist fallacy until all the day long. When you say, well, it's not natural for people to take lots of medicine, they'll say, oh, that's the naturalist fallacy. You're saying you have a bias toward the natural. But here's a case where they're just sort of have this sort of Goldilocks temperature of the Earth in 1800. Maybe, and again, like there's various data that says otherwise. Again, I know what the official party line is, but it's a mystery, and actually, and then when it comes to much longer ago, we're getting into a whole dearth of issues over there. So, like, I think this is a funny story. Like in like Lower Canada, for example, many of the people are like, hey, look, we'll get longer growing seasons if it's true. Which then says, wow, there are actually positive externalities toward this. And one way to deal is we have two competing, formal experts. You say take their two apocalypses and sort of like, well, if long COVID is a problem, yet everyone's going to be underwater in 20 years, what's to worry about long COVID? So, one way, or another way to go after these people is just force them to take bets on their position. If they're not willing to put their money where their mouth is, or they'll have to either say, well, or they'll have to say your bet is somehow just special pleading or something like that, or is unfalsifiable. But again, in a way, that's a win. If they say, well, this is not something we can actually determine, then you're sort of upfront admitting that you can't really determine. So I would say that those are a win. But keep on going. Sorry to interrupt again, Swithin.
No, that's perfectly fine. I think I've kind of come to the end of what I have to say here. Really, I mean, it's just, and this is in general. Nobody, I suppose, you could argue that the approach of the experts, so self-described experts today, is elitist in a bad way. They kind of think that there is no way that anybody who isn't trained in their world could possibly have an informed view on things. In a way, isn't it? It gives an epistemological question. It actually relates actually to the hyper specialization in sciences and things you have today. Is the idea, well, the only way you can know anything is if you're a real sort of deep empirical expert. And there's a disdain for generalism, which I think is false, and I think is a result of faulty sort of epistemological views. That really you just have an extreme sort of empiricism, and the only people who know what to do are the ones in an area, the ones who've done all the big maths and all the studies in those areas who know anything, because sort of logic, induction, and sort of general reasoning are really unimportant. And I think that's how you get sort of the cult of the expert who sort of refuses to engage with sort of like the intelligent layman, as it were, and or hides behind maths and rather than using language. But yeah, those would be sort of my final thoughts. Tim, any final comments?
Let's just make one quick final comment. I do think as I say it again, I do think there are experts. I mean, again, if I break a leg, I will go to the doctor, so to speak, and get it fixed. So, to point that out, I'll do that. Richard Dawkins was once complaining that, you have creationist pilots. It's like, it's worth pointing out, Dawkins, that, when the Wright Brothers first took off, almost by default, everyone was a creationist by default. So there's certain epistemological sort of big theses which are totally irrelevant to actually knowing things or not knowing things on experts or non-experts. So like a lot of like this, that's one thing that David Berlinski was pointing out, that like a lot of like climate change skeptical, like whatever, they actually work for various other like private sector firms. So someone views them as having expertise. So I do think there are experts. But a lot of things are just not really worth knowing or are irrelevant. And of the things that we do know and are relevant, it doesn't really matter. I mean, whether there's 8 planets or 9 planets is a sort of it is either a categorization or a word dispute, or is it just no consequence? I mean, of no foreseeable consequence. So people know what they need to know to get by. Whether there's extra knowledge out there, then the interventionist has to sort of have a stronger case to go against the sort of current existing or the non-interventionist case. It's not the other way around. You have to, the doctor has to explain why you think he is a good idea. Why you think he's a good idea to intrude into your body, not the other way around. Explain to me why I shouldn't intrude in your body. That to me is sort of discourse as violence type thing. That's state authority as violence. And hilariously enough, most of the and this is how useless so many people on the left are. Is they all are basically swore fealty to it. So yeah, I mean, in this way, it's very dark and depressing currently. But those are my. But and I'm not going to a psychiatrist to fix that problem either. They would just probably call me a cult member or whatever. But those are my final comments. So it's a very, very nice discussion here. Thanks for doing it.
Thank you for joining us. Oh, just one thing as well. There was a recent study came out saying that actually, like PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and depression stuff aren't actually illnesses. They're just sort of helpful responses to certain stimuli, and so you're not actually like there's not actually anything wrong with you if you suffer from these. And it's like, well, why did you think to begin with that was necessarily a problem? It was probably because you had the idea that there's a normal functioning that you should always attain to, and you've imported this onto lots of other people. Now, obviously, would I want to be in a position where I was permanently depressed? Well, no. And then there's ways and means of getting around that. But it's kind of the medicalization of kind of
the PTSD stuff is interesting because it assumes that because you take people who broadly grew up in peaceful-ish backgrounds and then send them off to a violent war. This occurred in many different societies, and then they come back, they sort of can't quite fit in. It's sort of an interesting sort of civilizational-esque question. So then the medical professionals will try to medicalize it as a sort of defect. Now, of course, you could argue, and Nassim Taleb interested to argue there's positive effects of it being under a high stress environment, but it is a interesting side effect of sending large amounts of people into violent situations who aren't normally involved in them. So that stuff is extra interesting for a variety of levels. But yeah, this time I am going to stop talking.
No, that does make a lot of sense. And again, this is sort of an expertisizing of things. Oh no, you just have these wrong levels of endorphins in your brain. We can change this by giving you Ritalin and other things. And in a way, there's a great level of hubris attached to that. But I've said enough. Experts are useful. The question is, what are they useful for? Skin in the game is important, and whether they're honest. Those would be my general criteria, along with obviously the empirical verifiable situation of you fly a plane. Have you crashed before? No. How many times have you flown? 1 million times. Great, fine. I'll go on the plane with you. No problem. So yeah. Now, I'd just like to thank everyone for listening. If you've enjoyed this, please share it with your friends and family. And please subscribe to us on Podbean and on YouTube. The more subscribers we get, the higher we get in the search rankings. And if you would like to contact the show for any reason, please contact us at mindcrimelibetyshow@gmail.com. That's Mindcrime Liberty Show.